To my immediate left is Standish E. Willis, who's an attorney in Chicago specializing in criminal defense and federal rights cases, and most of his civil rights practice involves suits against police for acts of violence and civil abuse. He chairs the Chicago chapter of the National Conference of Black Lawyers and co-founded Black People Against Police Torture, a grassroots community-based organization here in Chicago. Stan drafted a bill titled the Illinois Torture Inquiry and Relief Commission Bill, which was signed into law by Governor Pat Quinn in 2009. He earned his BA and master's degree here from the University of Chicago and studied master's level economics and earned a JD from the Illinois Institute of Technology's Chicago-Kent College of Law. Stan maintains an active public speaking schedule on issues related to the criminal justice system, the death penalty, police brutality, community control of police, the prison industrial complex, America's political prisoners, racism in the American legal system, and international human rights. Next to Stan is Professor Joy James, who's the Presidential Professor of the Humanities and a Professor of Political Science at Williams College. She's the author of numerous books, including Shadowboxing, Representations of Black Feminist Politics, Resisting State Violence, Radicalism, Gender, and Race in U.S. Culture, and she's also the editor of the Angela Y. Davis Reader. She's currently completing a book on the prosecution of 20th century interracial rape cases, tentatively titled Memory, Shame, and Rage. She's contributed numerous articles and book chapters to journals and anthologies addressing feminist and critical race theory, democracy, and social justice, and is the curator of the Harriet Tubman Literary Circle's digital repository at the University of Texas Human Rights Archive. And all the way at the end is Mariame Kaba, who's an organizer, educator, and activist and writer in Chicago. Her work focuses on ending violence, dismantling the prison industrial complex, and supporting youth leadership development. She is the founder and director of Project NIA, a grassroots organization with a mission to end youth incarceration. She's also co-founded several other organizations, including the Chicago Freedom School. She's a published author and writes a blog called Prison Culture. She's a teacher and has served on numerous nonprofit boards, and most recently she's been appointed by Governor Pat Quinn as a member of the Commission to End Disparities Facing the African American Community. And she is a self-described rabble-rouser and history buff. And we invite you to visit her Prison Culture blog. So join me in welcoming our panelists. I guess I want us to start by just giving everybody a chance to give some initial reactions to the film. None of us had seen it previous to this screening, so kind of take it all in and then kind of start to talk about what some of the, thank you, to fill in, is it on? Is it on? To fill in some of the gaps surrounding the story, to kind of talk about, and also to take the story up to the present day. I had anticipated there being much more about Angela Davis's contemporary activism, and it wasn't there. So probably we'll end up doing most of our talking about some of the themes of her life that began to be defined during this period that carried on, as she alluded to at the end. So I'm just going to give you all a chance to give some initial reactions.
Okay, so I can't keep passing. Well, first, it's a beautiful film, a documentary, and Lynch did an excellent job. It's seen her work on Shirley Chisholm, and that's more of a biographical narrative in terms of being able to trace, where you grew up, how you grew up, what politicized you. And we had to figure that out within the context of struggle, specifically a struggle for her life and a struggle for Black liberation. I mean, what could be added is probably the significance of Birmingham, Alabama, where she writes and talks about in other places as also being known as Bombingham because of the bombs against Blacks who are moving in and desegregating. And there's an irony here too, because if you read Condoleezza Rice's autobiography, she also, coming from the different ideological spectrum right on the other side, but she also has a story of parents having guns in the household because of racial terrorists. And the fact that the state will not protect you because it's in complicity with terrorizing Black life. So that kind of politicization, I think, was key for Davis, and you got a bit of it. There was something that was left out that I was struck by its significance. And again, it's alluded to, this whole discussion of Black love and intimacy and relationship with her family, with her comrades, with George Jackson. But if you go back to the bombings in Birmingham, Alabama, after the 1963 March on Washington, which is the celebratory moment where we shall overcome and we have this future of our children playing together, and then a matter of X number of weeks later, children, 4 girls are murdered. And Davis, if you see her in other clips, say the Black Power mixtape that was released recently, she talks about, and she's in prison when this interview is taking place, she talks about a neighbor asking her mother, Sally Davis, if she can borrow a car, better yet, if she can drive her to the church to pick up her daughter, I believe this one was Carol, because there's been a bombing at the church. And Davis says specifically, when the mothers arrive, what they find are heads and arms and body parts. And so you see this grief and this rage merge into one, and this becomes part of politicizing that makes, you know, the education that her sister says, what makes Angela Davis a revolutionary, but also in a way it's an education that makes all of us potential revolutionaries in terms of the vulnerability of our families and of our children.
So I thought that it was a really excellent film as well. And I think there were 3 things that I thought about quickly. One was Charlene Mitchell and the central role she really played in the kind of grassroots organizing aspect of this work, which didn't really come up except for once. Her name is mentioned in the film, and then you see all this stuff going on, but the connection between the people who make that happen and, you know, that's kind of was erased, which I worry about a lot, right? Because things don't just happen spontaneously. There are a lot of people behind the scenes constantly doing work, and I didn't feel like that really came through in a significant way, and I think we have to think about that as we think about today in organizing. The free all political prisoners part, I thought, that was really, you know, this was a film about Angela Davis, but she herself asked that a tagline be attached to free Angela Davis and all political prisoners, right? And it's something that I find really interesting in thinking about her as somebody who understood that it wasn't just about her, but it was about everybody and all of the other people who were also in the same position that she was in, is very different than when we think about free Bobby, free Huey, right? It wasn't free Bobby and all political prisoners. Angela Davis, though, and I think you have to think about that in terms of who she was and what she thinks about. And I think, frankly, her being a woman also makes that, you know, it's not just all about me all the time. And I think it's true. And then finally, I think, you know, how did she come to be interested in communism in the first place? I thought that was something that really could have had at least some explanation in the film, you know, why a communist? And that's the longest affiliation she had. She's, you know, she was part of the party for over 20 years. She was part of the Black Panther Party for a year and a half. And yet, you know, it's interesting to think about kind of what the choices are around that and why that's the case. And she comes to be involved in communism really as a teenager in terms of her exposure to it and her understandings of it and beginning thinking about Marxism. That's a huge, huge part of her, a long part of her intellectual life, you know, and that I feel like should have possibly had more to be said about it. But I think, again, overall, a really powerful film, a really important film. I'm glad that it's out, and those were just 3 things that came to mind.
I too thought the film was an excellent film, and it wasn't, the film caused me to think about several things that I don't think could have been included in the film, but I think could have been helpful for audience to know and understand. One thing, and you mentioned Charlene Mitchell, shortly after after the trial, I think it was 72 and 73, we organized a conference, a major conference here in Chicago. The conference was called the National Anti-Imperialist Movement in Solidarity with African Liberation. And Charlene played a very important role in organizing that conference. And we had that conference at Dunbar High School on the South Side. And what's significant about it, Angela had just weathered the storm, but she was here in Chicago to help organize the conference because she was our keynote speaker. And of course, it was organized, major impetus came from the Communist Party, and many of us who had been doing work at various levels were members of the Communist Party locally. The second theme that comes to mind that could not have been included in the film is that the struggle to free political prisoners, particularly those that were in prison as a result of COINTELPRO, this Hoover invention. But it's not just Hoover. It was a concerted effort, in the words of COINTELPRO, to neutralize black nationalist organizations, to neutralize charismatic leaders in the black community, like Elijah Muhammad, like Dr. Martin Luther King, like Stokely Carmichael. These were people they named. And we know that because there was a congressional investigation called the Church Committee back in 73, and all this came out as part of the congressional record. So this is not just Stan Willis rapping about something that is not factual. I do that occasionally, but not tonight. And those political prisoners, the United States government, through COINTELPRO, decided to neutralize, which is a military term, the Black Panther Party and other civil rights organizations, and that neutralization included a whole abundance of illegal things that came out of the Church Committee, including murder. And we know about one of the murders, two of the murders here in Chicago that was part of COINTELPRO, and that's the murder of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. But there were many others that we don't know about. There were dozens of Black Panther Party members murdered by the United States government. So that comes to mind. And lastly, what comes to mind is that those political prisoners that were in prison during COINTELPRO, many of them are still in prison, and many of them are dying in prison. And hopefully a film like this will cause us to revisit the political prisoner issue and demand that they're free.
And while we're on the topic of political prisoners, maybe one of you could give us a definition, because some people, it's an assumption that everybody knows what we mean by a political prisoner, and it may also be an assumption that there's no such thing as a political prisoner in the United States context. So would somebody like to address that?
I'll give it a try. We've had a lot of debate about political prisoners over the years. At least two major components that has been debated. I don't think it's necessarily resolved. It's resolved in my mind. One is political prisoner is somebody who goes to prison as a result of their political work. And we have a lot of those. Many of those are Black Panther Party members, but there are others. We had a meeting last year, a Jericho meeting. We found out there are political prisoners all over the place. We got Cuban political prisoners, the Cuban Five. But one of the developments during the years is that what about people that were not doing political work that ended up going to prison, but became political in prison, like George Jackson? Mm-hmm. So there's this debate going on, well, we can't include them, but I think we do include them, because a lot of the brothers, as we know from Attica and the Pontiac Rebellion and the recent rebellions, are politicized. And I think, in my view, we should include them because they're political prisoners now, and they're fighting for political causes, but they started their political work in prison.